I mean, this feels very close to my interest as someone who obviously works in media, and so many people on the left who are deeply frustrated by the way our movement has been represented, either in more establishment contexts like the two Bernie runs, or now as we're looking at another moment of protests being met with violent police repression on college campuses as the school years start back up again. And the mix of sympathy that I think is largely generated by independent media and TikToks and clips put on Instagram that people are responding to, I think, sort of authentically, and the sort of spin that you get from the mainstream media, who at best ignores what's happening and at worst manufactures consent for the repression. Not to mention, of course, the brutal imagery that we see coming out of Gaza every day, which gets a very similar treatment, largely ignored by the mainstream media or recontextualized and neutered the way we saw in remarks by Kamala Harris last night, for instance, where she just did her first interview since becoming the nominee. And when asked about Gaza, used evocative language about October 7th, saying that people were massacred, and then switched into a passive voice when talking about the estimated close to 200,000 people who have been killed in Gaza. So one camp gets, I think, slaughtered or massacred, I forget what she used, and the other camp gets have died tragically. Too many have died, and they deserve self-determination. One side gets the right to defend itself. One side gets an abstract self-determination.
President Biden has tried unsuccessfully to end the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. He's been doing it for months and months, along with you. Would you do anything differently? For example, would you withhold some U.S. weapons shipments to Israel? That's what a lot of people on the progressive left want you to do.
Let me be very clear. I am unequivocal and unwavering in my commitment to Israel's defense and its ability to defend itself. And that's not going to change. But let's take a step back. October 7, 1,200 people were massacred. Many young people who were simply attending a music festival. Women were horribly raped. As I said then, I say today, Israel has a right to defend itself. We would. And how it does so matters. Far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. And we have got to get a deal done. We were in Doha. We have to get a deal done. This war must end.
In the meantime,
and we must get a deal that is about getting the hostages out. I've met with the families of the American hostages. Let's get the hostages out. Let's get the ceasefire done.
But no change in policy in terms of arms and so forth.
No, we have to get a deal done. Dana, we have to get a deal done. When you look at the significance of this to the families, to the people who are living in that region, a deal is not only the right thing to do to end this war, but will unlock so much of what must happen next. I remain committed since I've been on October 8 to what we must do to work toward a two-state solution, where Israel is secure and in equal measure, the Palestinians have security and self-determination and dignity.
So, what do you do about that? Because you write, really interestingly about the sort of positive role social media has played in getting the spark in the first place, instigating the explosion of these movements. But that does seem to be a double-edged sword. We see the backlash. We see the bipartisan effort to cancel TikTok, to ban TikTok. And we see a lot of repression of speech on sites like Twitter by Elon Musk, who very selectively applies his quote-unquote free speech principles. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it is unfortunately baked into our mainstream media culture, into our political culture in the United States, that we talk about friends and enemies in different ways. We talk about people and movements that are allies of the U.S. and perceived as enemies of the U.S. in totally different ways. There's a double standard when we talk about protest movements. There's a double standard when we talked about victims. I think this is basically uncontroversial. It's deeply unfortunate. I wish I knew how to change it, but I think it is something that movements have learned to deal with and that they must learn to deal with. The way that a protest movement, say, is treated in a country or that takes place against somebody that the United States is trying to overthrow is treated very, very differently than a protest movement in like France or something, right? So when it comes to social media, and especially specifically, you mentioned the what happened after the attention given to the pro-Palestine movements in the United States, because that was another moment that was really reminiscent of what happened to my so many times in the mass protest decade, or in at least in my book, is that for much of 2024, these various types of protests were happening, either on campuses or not on campuses, old people, young people, encampments, on encampments. But after you got the crackdown on Colombia, that's what generated a huge amount of interest. That's what generated a huge amount of attention. And this is also always what happened in the 2010s as well. It's not just a poorly thought out or brutally executed crackdown that causes the explosion. It is a crackdown against a particular part of a society that is considered to be special. In Brazil, for example, police are routinely entering favelas and shooting Black and brown people. But when they cracked down on journalists from the middle class in the center of Sao Paulo, that's what got the whole country paying attention. And this is something that you can't snap your fingers and change. If you are one of those Colombia student protesters for whom I have huge amounts of sympathy, and I visited encampments and participated in protests myself, that means this particular weird media environment that we live in, where the media really cares about kids at Ivy League universities, like U.S. media is obsessed with the children. This is kind of normal, like moral panics about what's happening to our children, but especially because of the particular class composition of U.S. media, of my colleagues, there's a huge amount of attention paid to elite universities, right? Like there's just like you could just tell if you look at like the Atlantic or the New York Times, they must be getting a huge amount of clicks for these stories because they run them endlessly, whether or not there's a protest happening or not. But then when you get that huge amount of attention after the crackdown, this generates both opportunities and challenges. And the opportunities that people are paying attention, people are listening to your message, you are at the center of attention. But also these challenges, and you alluded to one of them, is the immediately quickly want to say what you are. And this happens, I don't know if you remember this moment, like in May or June, there was a bunch of journalists showing up at the encampments getting really mad that they couldn't lie about them, that they couldn't pick off one kid, get them to say something stupid, and then write up their story, because the students were smart enough to say, we have a communications office, just like the New York Times. If I showed up at your work and was like, give me your opinion on Gaza, would you give it to me? Or would you refer me to, we're doing the exact same thing that everybody else does, but they were getting so mad because in the 2010s, they had learned you could just sort of show up and you could say what the protest was. You could just say the protest was whatever you wanted it to be. If you liked it, you could be like, oh, it's about democracy and pro-America, which is what, at the beginning of the social media revolutions, or what were perceived to be at the time social media revolutions, I don't think that's right. The US loved social media because they could say, oh, like, this is helping us around the world. And then later, it's like, oh my God, I think China is making our kids understand what we're doing to Gazans. So we need to destroy TikTok. So this media structure is one that I think is unfortunately in place. Not only the collapsing, and again, I don't think it's necessarily great that it's collapsing, but objectively collapsing legacy media and the strange set of incentives that appear on social media. And this creates real opportunities and challenges. And the best lesson that a lot of my interviewees came away from this decade with was that you, at the very least, you have to understand the structure and have a strategy for dealing with it. Like, you can use the media for a while, but if you're going to actually want to change things that are going to get in the way of the privileges of elites, you have to expect some kind of a backlash. You have to have some way to get your message out. Ideally, you have your own media. Ideally, you have a concerted strategy for dealing with existing media. And to the credit of many of the student encampments that I visited, they actually came up with one, and it really upset a lot of my colleagues.
Yeah, I love that example. I do want to flag a couple of others from your book that I found really interesting. The strategic question of how to do protests well, before we get to the question of how to make them actually have a result, not just, kind of exist and get public sympathy. In Hong Kong, you note that protesters took over an airport, which but that part, like, it wasn't just that. I mean, because here's why I was so excited about it. In the U.S., we're often told that you need you need organizations, principally historically unions, that are organized enough to have labor impacts that force leadership to respond, right? Mm-hmm. You have to throw yourself upon the gears. And the follow-up to that from so many, guests, no shade to them at all on the show, has been, but also we are at historically low union membership. I mean, we're having, our little resurgence that we've been having since, 2018 or so, but still union density is incredibly low. And so we have to work a long way to getting the kind of density that we had in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s before we can really expect them to be able to affect change. Mm-hmm. I completely accept that, except that we do have these spontaneous moments that occur that seem to be squandered because there is this expectation that, well, we can't possibly do anything with them. Black Lives Matter, this moment around Gaza, et cetera, because the unions aren't there yet. We haven't built labor capacity yet. The seizing of the airport, to me, represents a strategy to grind the gears of a municipality to a halt, or in the case of Hong Kong, the entire island to a halt, because of how central, how important it is to the functioning of anywhere. Mm-hmm. And then the second aspect of it that was so interesting to me was that it made it more difficult for there to be brutal police repression because it's such a surveilled place. There's so many cameras around in the architecture of an airport. Right. That the protesters were relatively empowered to act without fear of even more brutal reprisals than we typically expect in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so go ahead.
No, you go.
My question is, what examples of like how to do protests well have you seen? Oh, another aspect of the Hong Kong protest that struck me was the kind of internal discussion. And again, we're going to come back to this leaderlessness and how that negatively impacts potentially the ability of these protests to be more successful. But there was this internal discussion of whether or not it was appropriate for some people in the protest to be using a sort of anti-Chinese slur. Right. Versus a strategy that kind of called in people in the mainland and said, basically, if you burn, we burn. The title of the book, that our fates are linked and that we shouldn't be feeding into a kind of antagonistic relationship that will lose sympathy from mainland China.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So blocking an airport, blocking transportation, blocking streets, blocking metro stations is something that absolutely gets the attention of elites, right? And so you saw this happen. You saw this shake out in different cases in my book. In Brazil, this is how it all starts. They shut down the streets in response to the rise in the price of a bus fare. In Chile, this is how 2019 starts and ultimately kind of indirectly puts Gabriel Boric in power, which is like a striking thing if you compare that to U.S. political culture, but he also hasn't done quite as well as many would have expected. And then in Hong Kong, you get a dedicated part of the protest movement, although this is smaller than the original very large rallies, saying we're going to actually try to make Hong Kong ungovernable. We're going to make it so business as usual cannot carry on. We're going to shut down the airports, shopping malls, this kind of thing. It absolutely works at creating an impact and getting people to respond. Now, what impact that is depends upon the degree to which existing elites believe that they cannot and should not repress you, right? So if you are seen as inimical to the nation and you shut down an airport, every country on Earth, because every country on Earth, whether we like it or not, relies upon police in the final instance to use violence against the population to reproduce the given order, they will just clear you out. No problems. If there's like a far right movement in Germany that shuts down the airports, they're just going to go arrest all of them. However, if elites feel that they should not or cannot repress that kind of a movement because they have a point, because the population believes that they have a point, but because they can back up this pressure that they're putting on them with other types of pressure, whether it be institutional, you refer to organized labor, whether it be from other sources of power in the society. This can force a confrontation when the terrain of struggle is good for your side. So in the case of Brazil, for example, it turned out that when there was a crackdown to get these kids off the streets because they were shutting down the main avenues of Sao Paulo, the people were shocked by the police crackdown. And, I was one of the reporters that went out in the weeks after this and asked everybody, what do you think about it? Well, I pay way too much for transportation. This is something we all can get behind. However, what did the People's Republic of China ultimately just do in Hong Kong? They thought that they could. I mean, we don't know exactly what they were thinking, but one narrative goes that behind the scenes, they just decided to let the kids tire themselves out, let the kids shut down the city for a while, because they knew that in the PRC, where there's a lot more people than there are in Hong Kong, they would be forgiven for, or at least the way that people understood what was happening in Hong Kong, they would be able to later go in and clean things up the way that they wanted. And that's ultimately what they did. And so it absolutely forces a struggle. But the decision as to whether or not you should force a struggle depends on whether or not that struggle is the terrain on which you want to fight your battle and whether or not it's the time and the issue around which you want to fight it. In the case of the Brazilian leftists and anarchists that put together the street movement in Brazil in 2013, they realized very quickly, we always thought that, like, in a sort of mystical way, the streets belong to the left. But it turned out we chose the center of the business capital of South America. We chose the main streets of Sao Paulo, where it's easier for rich right-wing people to get here than the working class that we're trying to defend. And soon they were actually expelled off the streets because they called for a battle on the streets of central Sao Paulo. And it turned out they had less people than their enemies. So that did not go the way that it definitely got the battle started, but they ended up losing. And they admit, I think now, that they lost. In Chile, it's very different. You have, once more, kids throwing their bodies up against the literal gears of the system. They're stopping turnstiles in downtown Santiago. There's a police crackdown. The president makes some ridiculous remarks which shock the nation. And then you get huge amounts of people pouring into the square, again, reminiscent of what happens in Ukraine. People that came in, the people that were maybe thought, what are these kids doing 2 days ago? But now they're shocked by the crackdown. But who ends up imposing the final solution? It's a bad turn of phrase. Who ends up imposing the final outcome in Chile is a set of young leftists that are in power, that have institutional capacity to come up with a solution which is more or less, and there's debates around this, what the students wanted. A sort of an anti-neoliberal program, the promise of overthrowing the Pinochet-era constitution. So I think there's the question of the best way to do a protest. I think there's a question of when to do a protest, and there's also the question of whether or not protest is the right thing. I mean, I think one of the things that I try to do in this book is to make things that started to appear natural, to allow them to appear to be, or to reveal them to be contingent and historical in choices. And sometimes a really confrontational protest is what you right now is what you want to do. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes that's going to be the best terrain on which you can fight. Sometimes there's this other thing you could do, which might not be spectacular, which might take some time, or it might be based on an entirely different set of calculations, which might be the best way to go forward.
Yeah, the question of whether or not the protest is the right thing to do at all is an interesting one. You know, our last episode, we talked a lot about the Powell memo and the Republican strategy to push back against the left movements of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, racial justice movements, labor movements, women's rights movements, et cetera. And they didn't do it by, protesting in the street saying, women shouldn't be able to have credit cards. They simply had a long game to control the courts, to establish a conservative media infrastructure, and have demonstrated a real savviness about the role that media can play. Now, whether or not the left has those kinds of strategies available to it because it is not aligned with moneyed interest the way the right is, there's not a world where the left can build its independent media infrastructure to the extent that we have an online media infrastructure. The most successful and largest ones have themselves been vulnerable to accusations of being co-opted. I'm thinking of TYT and this infamous kind of Katzenberg donation that allegedly changed the trajectory of the kind of coverage that they do. This is just what people say. I'm not trying to get into a big internecine left battle, but the point stands. So it does seem like it has to be protest. It has to be some kind of appeal to public sympathies at the same time that we do have our own kind of version of institutional growth, which is through labor action. Mm-hmm. That being said, this is like the central tension. If public appeal to sympathies is what has historically worked, at least if we think about things like the civil rights movement and Edmund Pettus Bridge and fire hoses and dogs and sit-in and lunch counters and all of those kinds of things, what does it mean that we're at a moment where they have not yet closed the window of opportunity on social media being independent media? Mm-hmm. And so many millions of people have seen the imagery from Gaza and mm-hmm. have seen the repression on college campuses. Mm-hmm. And yet it does feel like, at least at this juncture, that whether it's college administrators or the billionaires who are getting them fired or elected representatives who grandstand on Columbia's campus approving of the police behavior, or the mayor of New York who implements these crackdowns, that people across the ideological spectrum do feel very entitled to proceed with the repression regardless of how out in the open it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. There's two things I want to say, I think. I don't think, number one, that social media is independent. Exactly. I think that social media firms are for-profit corporations owned by oligarchs, which prioritize whatever content can keep you glued to your phone. And now that's different than being sort of the State Department coming up with a television channel. That's different than sort of a considered ideological project, but it ends up reproducing certain narratives, certain types of posts. And this is something that we see again throughout the 2010s. If you create a set of technologies which will put in front of your face the most shocking and distressing thing, you're more likely than ever in human history to see an image of a police officer committing a brutal act against an innocent citizen. And this powered huge amounts of what happened in the 2010s. And I think that, just like what we discussed in the campus protest, there are opportunities that arise from that, and there are challenges that arise from this particular type of social media environment. Because people like Elon Musk's different because he clearly does have an ideological project, but people like Mark Zuckerberg want to keep you looking at your phone so they can sell ads to furniture companies or clothing companies or whoever it is that whatever it is that's I'm moving right now.
You just tell on yourself?
Well, okay. I'm moving right now, so it thinks that I want to buy furniture. So that's really the game. And so it's a certain type of independence. And it allows us to do certain things, but I think that it is not the type of internet that we need to have, and I don't think it's the type of internet that I would like to have if we're going to actually have some kind of human liberation. But then, when it comes to the question of whether or not there should be protests, whether or not protests work, my approach to protest in general, going back to like the middle of the 20th century, when they really become a dominant tactic in human society for responding to elite abuse, my understanding is that protests are always fundamentally communicative actions. You're always somehow sending a message to somebody, whether that's the government or whether that's the rest of the nation. They're fundamentally always about this communication, and they're always fundamentally happening in concert with or somehow interacting with existing media, now both traditional and social media. There are cases where you can force change, I think, without any kind of communicative action, right? I mean, this is kind of a pure thought experiment. You could have a strike. You impose real costs on the owner of the factory. He realized he has to give a 50% raise. You're not going to go back to work. And then you get it. There's absolutely no protest. There's no communicative action. But probably in that case, you're probably going to want to. You might as well stand outside, get the message out about what you're doing, try to raise solidarity, try to create as much support in the society. But those are two actions. So you have to protest the communicative action and the imposition of the cost on the person. So what happened in the 2010s in these cases that I think led to such profound reversals is you had just the protest. Would have been good to have protests plus something else. You had just a protest often after there was nobody anybody to protest to. You had the repetition of sort of a communicative tactic when there was no more elite to talk to. It was time to go become the elites, or it was time to become part of a transitional government. It was time to go force some existing power structure to do something that you wanted it to. So the question is not protest yes or no, but protest alongside what else? And I think sometimes you can privilege to a greater or less extent the protest, but I think on its own, with no, somebody in power that's doing something you don't want to do, to get them to stop doing that, you either have to take their power away or make it so it is in their interest to do something different. I think rarely do protests convince the elites, like, oh yeah, I mean, maybe it's happened, is to convince elites, oh yeah, they're right, I should stop doing that, that's a horrible thing to do. They either convince them, oh, the people are going to be really upset if I don't do this thing, or in some way or another, they take away their power to continue with a policy.
Yeah, that's so central. The like, oh, the people are going to be really upset if we do this thing. My observation, especially in the sort of post Biden, Harris Waltz era, is that the sort of fear, it seemed, that existed even among establishment Democrats that Biden might lose and that an issue like Gaza might be a tipping point sort of evaporated almost overnight.
Right.
And I connect it to the left's willingness to buy the idea that Kamala Harris is going to be a departure. Now, whether or not she can stick that landing is very much up in the air. After her first interview, there was a lot of anger, precisely because she reaffirmed her unwillingness to impose an arm embargo or to depart at all from Biden's policy on Gaza. But that piece where it's like, you have to be afraid of there being some consequences from the public if you cross them, seems to me to be largely lost on the contemporary left, who has, especially in the last week or so, really adopted this posture that says something along the lines of revolutionaries, these so-called revolutionaries that aren't going to vote for Kamala Harris, are so naive. They think that they're going to do a revolution overnight. I would argue that's a straw man, but I'm just trying to try to kind of articulate what the narratives are out there right now. They say there's no point in voting for any kind of third party or trying to build any kind of third party because they are not going to win. That we need to work within the Democratic Party and push them to the left, but not right now while they are most solicitous of our support because they're in the middle of an election. At some point down the road in the future, when what we think about them frankly won't matter at all. And so it feels to me like this kind of subversion of the kind of leverage that your book points to as a way to convert revolutionary action or protest into actual revolutionary change. And I wonder, given not just these kind of contemporary examples of the first decade of the 21st century, but also the kind of revolutionary theory of the beginning of the last century, what you make of sort of the prevailing ideological posture of the American left as they stare down the barrel of what I would argue is a very similar opportunity to force the left party that we have, which is the Democratic Party, to respond to very pressing concerns. At that point, the on-camera murder of an American by the police. In this instance, the mass slaughter, genocide of tens of thousands of people in Gaza. You know, what do you make of what feels to me to be a lack of appetite, I would say, for exerting leverage right now?
First, when it comes to Palestine, I would say that if the U.S. left had the capacity to impose real costs on the U.S. government for supporting Israel as it committed war crimes, we wouldn't be where we are now. Israel wouldn't have committed the war crimes in the first place. If we had, going into the 2020s, if the left had capacity, institutional, labor, political, economic capacity to impose real costs on the U.S. government for assisting to carry out war crimes against Palestinian population, they wouldn't have happened. Hopefully what we're seeing now is some kind of a way to construct that leverage. Now, lots of other people, lots of other groups have leverage over the U.S. government. Israel and its supporters have leverage over the U.S. government. Coca-Cola has leverage over the U.S. government. There are many ways to have leverage, which is not electoral. Governments, as a general, again, very broad rule, governments in capitalist societies care about economic growth, and governments in democratic societies care about getting reelected. So those are the really obvious pressure points, right? Coca-Cola does not win elections. It has lobbies. It has people well-paid professionals that exert economic influence on the U.S. government. AIPAC has money that it uses to exert influence, and it also uses its resources to whip up public support for particular policies to place electoral pressure on the United States government. So there are a number of ways I think that the Palestine movement could create ways to put real pressure. I mean, again, I don't know if you disagree. Like a huge question over the last year is the how much the man of Joe Biden matters. I mean, in general, historically, I don't favor these kinds of explanations that talk about a particular guy and what he's like, but maybe he actually just like was stuck in his views from like, I can imagine, I don't know if you disagree, I can imagine a scenario in which he didn't even really understand that there was pressure on him to change his policy, that like he wasn't even in a position to really rethink very much in the last year. Do you think that's overstating?
Do you mean because of sort of his cognitive state, or do you
I think that he's particularly
yes men around him,
particularly committed to Israel for a very long time, and not in a mood, let's say, or perhaps didn't have the capacity to change his mind about a lot of things in the last year.
Yeah, maybe, but it does.
I'm not sure
feel either. It feels as though, take the reporting with a grain of salt, but it does feel like what ultimately convinced him to step down was Pelosi really confronting him with poll numbers. And I think at one point he said in an interview, if it looks like I can't win, then I'll step down. Mm-hmm. And that maybe is what convinced him. And part of him not being able to win is the uncommitted movement having 100,000 votes mm-hmm. in, a swing state like Michigan, and tens of thousands of votes in all of these other states around the country, including other sorts of swing states like Georgia. So that is, to me, connected to Palestine. That suggests there being some acknowledgement that his policy, or at least the perception that he in particular is attached to that policy, it was detrimental to the Democrats' electoral efforts. Now, the smoke and mirrors of the handoff to Kamala Harris is troubling to me, because here's why. I'm trying to keep individual names and stuff out of this, because I want to be gracious and not start beef. But there are so many people that I like and consider friends on the internet right now who should know better as leftists, who have an analysis of how power works and how American empire works and what the permission structure is of being allowed to lead the United States of America, as mm-hmm. evidenced by all of the tools that were levied to prevent Bernie Sanders from accomplishing that. That to be in the position that she's in, to have been picked to be vice president in the United States of America, to the oldest president in the history of America, who had a real likelihood of becoming president at some point, she would have had to align with not just Biden's personal feelings toward Israel, but what has been longstanding U.S. policy since the founding of Israel to begin with. So the idea that you would be hoping that Kamala Harris, who was chosen by Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic establishment, and who the entire Democratic Party basically threw democracy out of the window to nominate without there being any primary, without there being any kind of open convention, any kind of democratic process, of course, was going to continue the Biden administration's policies, because it's not the Biden administration policy, it's America's policy toward the Middle East. The reasons that you alluded to for why Israel and Saudi Arabia and Egypt are essential to the quote unquote stability of the region to assure American capitalist hegemony globally. That's the whole bag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why is it that the left, and this is why I keep saying we're going to get into theory and then we never get into theory, but let's get into theory. This is why it was so frustrating to me. I'm not upset that some random person on the street who's not that plugged in is excited that, oh God, thank God I don't have to root for the old guy who can barely get through an interview. Here's a young, attractive, invigorated woman. Fine. Like, I understand why they're excited. They're coconut pilled. But I don't understand why people who purport to have an understanding of how power works in the United States and America would ever for a second entertain the idea that Kamala wasn't going to be more of the same old thing.
No, I think that it would have taken a really big protest explosion, a very, very large amount of pressure to make the U.S. abandon Israel as an ally. I think the question I had over the last 6 months
But not even that, just to threaten an arms embargo.
So yeah, the question I had over the last 6 months was to what extent is this protest movement, which is real and powerful, and I think should be said, is not only about, in the short term, changing U.S. policy or changing electoral outcomes. It also matters. It just matters that there are people around the world coming out to support Palestinians. But we as Americans, in the most powerful country that's ever existed, with the largest military that's ever been, the largest death machine ever put together by far, we have a special ability to put pressure on that machine, right? So the tiniest bit that we can make it less evil, there's quite a lot of impact that can be had around the world. And so the question I was asking sort of myself and just now is not like, oh, is Kamala going to be an entirely different person? But to what extent was Biden's strange figure of Joseph Biden in 2023 and 2024 made it a little bit harder to get through to elites? But anyways.
No, it's an interesting question, though, because look, even if it's true that Biden was uniquely intractable because of whatever reason, cognitive or personality or whatever.
Just history of, affection for Israel.
Sure. That doesn't mean that Kamala Harris would necessarily, without pressure, be different. It still requires a willingness.
Because there's real pressure. Because there's, other people are putting real pressure, right? Like, this is the thing about the state, especially the United States government. A lot of people really care what it does, right? So the reason I brought up stuff like Coca-Cola or Facebook, I think helps us to understand something which is not everything, but crucial to understand, is that you don't have to be right? Like, if you're the United States government and you are credibly threatened with economic slowdown or credibly threatened with losing an election, it doesn't matter how wrong you are, they're going to stop and pay attention. You can be as right as you want, but there's lots of other people in the U.S. economy. There's lots of other political actors that are threatening the Democratic Party with real consequences. And being right is great, but what they really care about is, can you shut down the economy for a few days? And again, this is something that comes up many, many times in my book. What often really happens, you alluded to shutting down an airport, but what often made it really hard to ignore a protest is when there is a labor stoppage, even a short one for a few days. Because no matter what your ideological predisposition is, every leader in a capitalist society wants the economy to keep running. They care about the reproduction of the accumulation of capital. So if we could dream up imaginary scenarios, if you had an entirely different set of organizational circumstances in early or late 2023, if, for example, there was a huge wave of strikes across the United States, all the unions said, you cannot fund or support or arm Israel as it commits atrocities. Whether or not they convinced, it would matter to some extent how much they convinced the broader population, the U.S. government would pay attention, Republican or Democrat. Almost any government that I could think of would pay attention. Again, you can't snap your fingers.
But also, Vincent, it's also like, even short of that, and I'm not saying it would have the same impact, obviously, but even short of that, there was this kind of optimistic moment where Sean Fain, who is the most name recognition, popular union leader in the United States of America, who really embodies a lot of hope for how business unionism can be defeated and how we can have a new era, withheld his endorsement of Joe Biden for some period of time. And Gaza was cited as one of the concerns. Mm-hmm. And then they endorsed, right? And then they endorsed, and is speaking at the DNC. And when speaking at the DNC, doesn't use the national platform to go off script and condemn the party for its failure to act. Neither does AOC, who instead frankly lies and says that Kamala and Biden are working tirelessly to accomplish a ceasefire in Gaza. Just days, it turns out, before Kamala Harris reaffirms that she is not at all going to depart from Biden's policy, right? And so, like, I'm sensitive and grateful for the opportunities that labor action can bring, but I can't help but observe that a lot of stuff that leads up to that, that's short of that doesn't require the organization of that, is also not being done. And it's frustrating because perhaps it is those actions that also can help to bring more people into labor and help make the likelihood that we do have enough organization to affect a general strike or what have you actually comes to fruition before some pie in the sky point 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now.
Right. I mean, if U.S. labor had the power of influence that Raytheon and the weapons industry had, then you could have an entirely different scenario. But I don't think we're going to get there.
Don't?
I think, huh?
They don't. They don't. But here, do they or don't they?
They don't. They do not. And I don't think they're going to get it. Right? Like that would be so hard to construct. Right.
So what are we saying here? We're saying that we all have to hold our nose and just wait till labor is strong enough. But you also
no. I'm saying that if you could construct a scenario where they're as strong as the weapons industry, there'd be a different story. But I think that as much as I think that we should try to make labor as strong as we can, you can't count on that happening. I don't think it's going to happen in the short term and the medium term. Like, the best we can do is put together a more powerful force than we have now. And again, I do think that I agree with you that it's weird to sit back and be like, well, let's just wait until we reconstruct 20th century labor, because I don't see that happening in the short term. On the other hand, in the cases, at least in the book, it was often said in the beginning of the 21st century that organizations were hard to build now. People are too individualized, they're too atomized, they're too alone on their phones, they're too alone in their homes. People are working too hard. People are no longer working in the same factories. It's harder to organize people than ever before. I think that the events of the 2010s prove that was true, but also precisely because it's true, relatively small groups of people ended up having a huge amount of influence on the final outcomes of these strange and unexpected opportunities that come along. So given that these strange and unexpected opportunities cannot really be planned for, and given that these strange and unexpected opportunities often discredit a lot of the power centers that are central to whatever given national society, even like the bare little beginning of a new movement ended up mattering quite a lot in comparison to the scorched earth of an individualized society. So in the U.S. context, and again, I don't think there's going to be like a collapse of the U.S. I don't see that coming either. But I absolutely agree with you that as much as I think that we should strengthen labor as much as possible, you can't just think that automatically it's going to be at a point soon where you can put as much pressure on the U.S. government as the real actors in U.S. political and economic culture.
But this is where I'm caught up. So a couple of things come to mind. One, I had a guest on maybe a month or so ago who leads the BDS weapons boycott movement. And he referenced, for example, workers at various shipyards and at various companies across the world who have refused to facilitate the shipment of weapons to Israel. Thinking of having as much power as Raytheon seems, if you're talking about money and kind of direct lobbying power, well, yeah, that does seem like a very tall order. Thinking of it in terms of people power, where for this bomb to get from point A to point B, it requires these dozens of people working at the shipyard, these hundreds of people working at a shipyard to be willing to do it, is a very different thing. And organizing that shipyard, it seems like a much smaller order, a tall order. I'm not saying it's easy, but a much smaller order. We've seen employees at Google, some of these tech companies, walk off the job because they say, I don't want to be designing intelligence that Israel is using to target and kill Palestinians. Why are we thinking in kinds of those terms? The equivalent of shutting down an airport could be shutting down Google's ability to run its servers, in the United States of America, because enough, progressive-minded people or simply humanitarian justice-minded people are willing to throw their bodies on the gears. And this is what I'm trying to find a quote, because there was some point in the book where you were citing, you were talking about the sort of difference between, what was it, the Leninists and those who adopted a more kind of horizontalist view of how to do change, right? And the one argument is that Marx says those who cannot represent themselves will be represented. If there's a kind of a vacuum, a leadership vacuum, an ideological vacuum, it's going to take the form of predominant modes of thought that are out there in the ether, which are the establishment modes of thought. And there's that real risk of being co-opted. We saw that, I think, with the Black Lives Matter movement. I remember in 2016 being a Bernie broad, being out there on the internet, tweeting away as an anonymous citizen, seeing at one point that Black Lives Matter had a website where they had articulated their policy agenda, which was much broader than criminal justice reform and included things like Medicare for all and $15 minimum wage. And I got really excited because I said, oh, what an opportunity to prove to the media class who is manufacturing consent for Hillary Clinton and really buttressing it with these claims that Black people like Hillary Clinton and Bernie is a racist and somehow Hillary is for the Blacks and also my abuela and all of that identity politics stuff that was happening at the time. That if you just look at the policy, it's obvious that Black Lives Matter's policy agenda aligns with Bernie Sanders' policy agenda. And certainly if someone just raises this flag and tweets about it enough or gets the attention of the Black Lives Matter leadership, they will come themselves to the conclusion that they should be endorsing Bernie Sanders in a way that would really upset all of the media narratives around the election, because at the time there was a lot of sympathy among the media elites for the Black Lives Matter movement. What happens? All of a sudden, the website disappears. It wasn't up for very long. It just went away. And to date, you'll find it very difficult to find any kind of centralized, organized articulation of what the goals of the movement are. And of course, we've all covered and heard endlessly about all of the leadership failures, the embezzlement of money, the mismanagement, all of the things that happened with the people that became sort of the leaders of the movement. And I should mention also in 2016, shortly after, the website disappears, here comes DeRay McKesson, who was kind of an anointed leader by the media of the group, endorsing Hillary Clinton. No explanations needed. So what am I trying to say? What am I getting at? I guess what I'm asking is about this. It seems to me, and you come to this conclusion as well, that this idea of a leaderless movement, which was really romanticized, I would say, at least in my kind of adulthood as I've been paying attention to these sorts of things, seems to be like, like op shit. Like it seems like quite obviously if it's not invented by the CIA as a strategy to make our movements fail, it might as well have been, because it seems very effective in not creating infrastructure to withstand being co-opted, to make concrete demands, to plan next steps and day after steps, all because there's no one there to do it. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.